Windows Server 2019 System Administration. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Prakash Pradhan, your trainer for this entire series of Windows Server 2019 Administration part. Now, today we have taken a topic DHCP. If you remember, this is the day 2, part 1. Today's topic is the DHCP Server. We are going to discuss about the meaning of DHCP Server, what is DHCP scope, what is the meaning of lease, what is the meaning of DHCP exclusion, what is the meaning of DHCP reservation, what is meaning of DHCP failover, how this failover is being configured. The entire things we are going to discuss or learn by this session. Since this topic is quite huge, it's a big topic, so that's why I guess we are going to have at least 2 to 3 sessions for this complete presentation of your DHCP implementation, including your failover. Please bear with me. This video will be is going to be a bit lengthy, and I also suggest you to go through first theoretical portion because it's our tendency. We understand we always wanted to see only the practical things, but we miss few theoretical things that will definitely affect us in our real world scenario. Because in this DHCP failover, this configuration also, there is a one setting that we hardly mention in theoretical portion, and we complain at last. In spite of doing all the DHCP failover steps, still DHCP failover did not function because there is a one setting in DHCP failover server that is by maybe due to some unavoidable circumstances, or because we can't say it's a mistake made by the this Microsoft, this company, but still there is a one setting in DHCP failover that is by default not selected, and we have to select manually. That is hardly mentioned in any book, so that's why please go through the theory first. Okay, so let's start now. So first, when we talk about the DHCP server, we need to understand what is DHCP server and why do I need to learn this DHCP server as a system administrator. Okay, the first work of a system administrator in any network environment is to set a communication, okay, a link between two devices in order to use any network resources. And we hardly assign static IP in a real world scenario, because in organizations we might be having more than 100 and 200. I myself have worked in many organizations where the number of computers are more than 400. Now you think yourself, if we have to assign static IP, okay, for the 400 to 500 computers, that's not practical actually. So what we do now, in order to reduce our burden, we give this responsibility of setting up this network communication with the IP address to the DHCP server, and that topic we are going to discuss first. Now, first, what you need to understand, when I turn on my PC after loading a system required files, the next step or the next thing it wanted to have is the IP address in order to set the communication in a network system if it is connected to the switch, router, or any wireless devices. So now it goes in search of IP if static IP is not assigned. So the process of searching IP address by any workstation from the DHCP server or the router, that process is known as a discover. That means the client will go in search of IP. After that, when the client discovers a DHCP server that is meant to distribute IP to the workstation, now DHCP server would like to offer, since you have discovered. Okay, it's similarly going to have a cup of tea evening time or in the morning time. You go to tea stall, you discover the tea stall actually. So after that, anyone from that tea stall definitely is going to offer you a cup of tea, or definitely he or she is going to ask you, sir, would you like to have a cup of tea? Because since it's a tea shop. So after it offers, that asks you, would you like to have a cup of tea? Then only you are going to say, yes, would you mind to give me 1 cup of tea? Similar thing is implemented over here. What we do now, your PC goes in search of your IP to the DHCP server, that is the discover. After you discovered, after you find a tea shop, then anyone from that shop will ask you, would you like to have a cup of tea? Similarly, now after you discover a DHCP server, it's going to ask you, would you like to have one IP that is in my scope, that is in my range? That's a number 2 step that we call offer. After DHCP server offer an IP, again your work, your step now, your turn. Now you are going to request, yes, please give me this IP address. So after you request, you make a request to the DHCP server, then it will assign one IP address and it will keep the record of your MAC address in its database. That's an acknowledgement. That means, okay, I have assigned an IP address to you, and if this DHCP server has a failover server anywhere, it is going to update this package information to the failover server as well. That means if you want to work properly as a system administrator with using any server operating system, you need to understand the concept of DORA. That means discover, offer, request, acknowledgement. Okay. Now, after you understand the concept of DORA, you need to understand the few things that you find after you add a role of DHCP server or when you configure a DHCP server. The first thing is DHCP scope. Scope is just a range of IP addresses that the DHCP server will assign to the workstation. Okay, when your workstation turn on the PC, it discovers any DHCP server. Okay, and when DHCP server wanted to offer an IP address, okay, after the client is, requested to you, that IP address will be given from its available range of scope. So that is only scope actually. Example, if you have decided to distribute 5 IP addresses in your DHCP server, so that 5 IP addresses will be treated as a scope in a one range. Okay. Now next one, after any workstation has obtained an IP address, that IP address will be counted as a DHCP lease IP address, and this DHCP assigned IP address will be always by default. Please don't misunderstood me over here. The DHCP whenever gives any lease IP address, by default it is temporary assignment of an IP address to that device over the network. It might be for few minutes, few hours or few days. By default Windows Server DHCP lease period is 8 days actually. I repeat again, when DHCP server assign IP to the workstation with the DHCP role, that IP assigned from the scope is temporary assignment. If my computer obtains any IP address, that is not permanent. That is going to be expired soon. And the next topic over here, third one over here, is the DHCP exclusion. DHCP exclusion means after you define certain scope, the range of IP address that you wanted to distribute among your client, if by some chance, some need, it has become your necessity to exclude any of the IP address for your future work. For example, if I have created a scope where the 5 IP addresses were there to be distributed, but later on you come to know that one printer server is supposed to be installed in the coming days. So for the printer server, what you need? IP address, because that printer server will be accessed over the network. So whenever any device you would like to access over the network, obviously you are going to need IP address. So for this kind of work, we used to exclude any of the IP from the range only. It is within the range, but that will not be counted. That means that IP will not be distributed to any of the client by the DHCP server. So that's a DHCP exclusion. And the next one, so just now we discussed that any IP sometime we need to exclude for the future work. That means for the printer server. That means if any device wanted to have same IP all the time, example, printer server, file server. I do believe you understand the concept of having a reservation of IP through the DHCP, that some of the servers IP should not be changed. Never, never, never. Why? All the time the clients are going to access the same IP in order to use any of the resources in your networking environment. Example, file server. Example, printer server. Might be some other servers having specific server roles deployed. Any app deployed over your network system. So reservation of IP in a network means to assign one IP permanently to that device forever, and that IP address will never get changed. That's a DHCP reservation. Now the next thing what we need to make clear over here with us is the failover plan. Okay, you cannot say that once the DHCP server is designed, deployed in your network, that DHCP server never goes down. We cannot give guarantee for this. Technical issues are there. Okay, sometime your server might go down. It might be due to your power backup system. Okay, or sometime your system might get crashed. So in that case, none of the workstations in the network will be able to communicate with each other. That means completely network down due to the lack of the IP. Okay, so in that case, you need to have a plan B. Failover plan has to be there. So when we talk about DHCP failover plan, so far the Windows Server has given us with the 2 DHCP failover plan options. Okay, that we'll discuss. But before that, we'll see a few requirements before we configure the DHCP failover. Number 1, you need to have 2 servers. Obviously, we are talking about the failover, so that's why we need to have 2 servers. And then both the server must be running Windows operating system, but it's not mandatory to be identical. Okay, and in both the servers that is going to act as a DHCP and DHCP failover server need to have, DHCP server role, and the IP should be static. And obviously we use all these things in a domain and environment only. But if you have firewall in your network system, you need to understand 2 things. Number 1, port number 647 must be open on both the servers. Number 2, clocks on both the servers must be synchronized. Okay, within 1 minute. Otherwise, you will have problem. Okay, now I was talking about the failover mode. We have 2 failover mode that's been offered by Microsoft so far. Number 1, load balancing mode. Load balancing mode means when 2 DHCP server partners are configured properly, one of the server will distribute only 50% of the scope that you have assigned, and second server will assign the 50% of IP scope that is being assigned by the primary DHCP server. So when any workstation turn on their PC, it discovers the first server. Okay, and it will exchange that package to the DHCP server 2, also updating its database that this IP address is being assigned to this MAC address. Now second time, when another PC turn on and it comes in search of the IP, now this time the discovery will be done to the DHCP server 2. So it's a 50-50 mode actually. So that is known as a load balancing mode. But again, we need to think of a plan B over here. What if one of your server goes down? That is the concept of DHCP failover in a load balancing. So when your first, or I should say the primary DHCP server goes down, immediately the state will be connection interrupted state to the secondary or the second DHCP server. So second DHCP server will automatically understand my load balancing mode is being interrupted. That means first DHCP server will not be able to give you any of the IP. That is why now what's going to happen? Now the second server will be active server for distributing the IP in your network. Okay, now all the requests will be redirected to the second failover server. Now, as soon as state interrupted is counted, now the switchover interval time will start counting. Okay, this setting can be done manually by the system administrator. Now, after, if you notice over here, state switchover interval is being noticed or notified, or it has started its event because the connection was interrupted. After that, when the maximum client lead time is over, now the second DHCP server will completely make it sure that my primary server is down. It's not in interruption mode. It's completely down. Now it's my responsibility to distribute this IP. That means 100% of IP from my side only. Now the entire network workstations will get IP address from the second DHCP server. So this is your first DHCP failover load balancing mode. Okay, and when primary DHCP server comes online, immediately the secondary failover DHCP server will sync all the packet to your first primary server, and it will continue their work as it is. What if you selected standby mode rather than using the failover mode? If I select standby mode of DHCP failover in Windows Server 2019 Standard Edition, only one partner will be active at a time. Whereas in load balancing mode, both the servers will be on and both the servers will be active at the same time. Both the partners are active at the same time because they distribute IP in the ratio of 50-50. But if I select standby mode, in that case, first server will get 95% of IP and second server will be able to get only 5% of IP. And here, all the broadcast, that means all the discover package will go to the first primary server. And the second server will stand by. It will not be active at the same time. But don't forget, in between, if any workstation gets an IP address from the 95% IP issuing server, it is going to update or send update package to the standby server as well in order to update its database. So while using standby DHCP mode, I mean to say, if primary DHCP server goes down, now what happens? The same process now. Second server will be activated because it will enter in a state connection interrupted state. And the same process like load balancing method will get started. So it will first start distributing only 5% of IP. Okay, if in between any of the computer comes over here renewing its IP, obviously it will be done by the server that is able to issue only 5% of IP. Okay, and when the first server comes up, again it will sync and again first server will start distributing the 95% of its IP. So this was the theoretical portion of the meaning of the DHCP server and the DHCP failover mode. Now without wasting your precious time, I would like to take you straight to my DHCP server. Now this is the PC, okay, that I'm going to treat it as a DHCP server. If you notice over here, see there is no DHCP server. So I do have a client machine over here. At the same time, let's see that my client machine is this one. This is your Windows 10. So if you want to see my configuration, so let's see, my IP address is, this one is my IP address because my wireless is on. Okay, my wireless is on. So that's why what I'm going to do over here now, I'm going to, just a second. So now I'm going to disable my wireless. Okay. Means even my virtual operating system Windows 10 will not be able to get IP address now. See here. Okay, I'll log in as this. I repeat again, there is no DHCP server. Okay, I've got two computers, that means two operating system here. One is a Windows Server 19 Standard Edition, where we are going to install the DHCP server role and where the Active Directory domain controller was already installed last time. Okay, now since it was synced with my Microsoft account, so it's taking time. Don't worry, it comes. Okay, it won't take much time. Okay, here it is. Now if I release my IP, okay, I'm going to release. I do believe you know all this. Now if I release and I try to find it out, my new IP address in this Windows 10 operating system computer. Now let's see what will be the IP. I guess it is the APIPA. So it's coming, don't worry. There must be APIPA IP address. It should come, wait just a second. Okay. See here, this is the APIPA IP address. That means now there is no DHCP server. Okay, now let's go to the PC where I'm going to install the DHCP server. Okay, this is my server that I'm going to use as a DHCP server to show you practical implementation of DHCP server. Now I'm going to add a server role. Okay, please follow the steps carefully. It's a role based because we're not going to this remote desktop. Now this is my domain which we have configured in our first session. This is the IP and this is the operating system. Here, as you can see, it's a standard edition. Now after that, I'm going to use DHCP server role over here. Okay, It's a role, it's not feature. Then next, it's simple. Next, next, there's nothing. Install, done. It's done. No, just a role is being added. Now the configuration is left. Okay, now we need to configure the further for the continuation of creating your scope, okay, creating your reservation, creating your exclusion range, or making sure that any client has obtained IP from your DHCP server. So the entire things are going to be configured from this DHCP server itself. So by the time it loads, or I mean to say add this DHCP server role in my primary server, please bear with me because it's taking time, because I'm using my virtual machine. My workstation is also virtual machine and my server as well is a virtual machine over here. Okay, let it install. In physical machine it won't take this much time, okay, since it's a virtual one, that's why. It's almost done, 50% almost done. Now it's almost done. I do not want to pause this video in between because I want you all to see practical. Okay, since it is done, now if you notice over here, exclamation has come because the configuration is not done. So let's complete this. Okay, now after that click next. This is your username, or that means your credential through which I am going to configure this DHCP. Okay, commit, it's done. It's so simple. DHCP server role is being added, but it's not configured. See, now if I go to DHCP role that's been added just now, you'll see your screen like this. IP version 4. There is no scope. See, there is no scope at all. So what you need to do now, right click IP version 4 and create new scope. Okay, now next, and write the name. Okay, name, let's say Biotech DHCP, or in the description you can give anything you want. Now here it's asking the scope range actually. So how many IP addresses you are interested to distribute among your client. So in my case, let's say let's say from the 5 I would like to distribute 192.168.1.10. I guess the 6 IP addresses are more than enough since we are using the IP version 4 class C, class full IP. That's why see the entire thing is done. Length is 24-bit. Now next, now it's asking you the IP address that you would like to exclude. Do you remember? Exclusion range. Now in a exclusion range, okay, now here you can exclude any of the IP address from the range that you have defined, but so far I don't want, because I want to show it practically. So I simply want you to go to next. Okay, if you remember, see 8 days is been assigned by Microsoft by default, and it can be changed also, which we'll be doing later on. Okay, now do you want to activate this? Obviously I'd like to activate. Now it's asking, do you have any router in a network that you would like to use as a gateway? So let's do this one, though I don't have this. Okay, just to show you, if you have any router, okay, that you want to use for your client in order to use the internet as a gateway, you can write it over here so that your client gets DNS IP address, your client gets your host IP address, and your client also gets the gateway IP address also. Now it's asking your domain, since it is already registered and this PC itself is a DHCP server, so it comes automatically. And then next, After that, it's asking you the wins. It's a legacy application. If you have any app, it's some sort of this legacy application. In that case, you are going to use it. But for me, right now, I'm not using any legacy app. So I'm going to click it simply next. That means I'm going to exclude this one. Now it's asking you, would you like to activate right now? Obviously, I'm going to do this. So next, done. It's simple. Now, if I expand this one, can you see this? Our scope is created. Address pool is here. See, 1 to 10. What if you wanted to modify? Okay. Exclusion, entire thing is here. Now see. Entire informations are here. This will be saying in detail. Now I need to see, is my DHCP server properly configured? That means, is any workstation in a network able to obtain IP from my DHCP server? Now if I see my IP is still OPIPA. Why? Because I have not discovered. So in order to obtain IP address from the DHCP server, if I leave this PC as it is for a few minutes, definitely it will be able to obtain IP from the DHCP server. But right now, I don't want to waste your time, so I'm gonna renew. So it will go in search of the IP from the DHCP server, and that DHCP server has assigned the IP address. Now see, if you notice over here, here it's getting the IP address, same one like previous one. So I will flush this one. I'll flush it. Sorry. I'll flush it. I will release it. Let it release completely whatever IP address was in its memory, in its cache, and then IP config renew. Otherwise, I need to turn off my wireless because it's getting the IP address from my another wireless router. See, congratulations, successfully the DHCP server is able to distribute IP to the workstation. So if you notice that I gave my gateway as a 15, that was used for the router. Okay, now I need to make sure that this IP has come from my DHCP server. So let's go to our DHCP server. This is our DHCP server. If I go to list, remember, once the client obtain any IP address from the DHCP server, that will be under the list. If I refresh it, see, this is the name of that device. Okay, this is the name of that device, and it has obtained IP 1.5. That is this one. This is my client machine 1.5. Now, if you'd like to see further the detailed information, when did my PC obtain IP address from the DHCP server, how long this IP is going to be used, when it is going to be expired, when do I need to renew, in that case you can add this information over here, all. Okay, see here, it's giving you the detailed information, entire thing. It's coming from DHCP server, yes. Auto configuration enable, yes. IP address, this is the IP address I obtained. This is my subnet marks. When did I obtain this? Monday, November 2 at this time. When this is going to be expired? Tuesday. That means for 8 days. I told you. Okay. So now after this, if I go to my DHCP server over here, this is address pool, this is address list, and reservation is also there. How to configure reservation? Right click, new reservation. Now give the IP. Let's say 192.168.1.9. I would like to reserve it. For whom? Any MAC address that you wanted to give. You need to write the MAC address for that. So that will be reserved permanently. Okay. Now, after that, if you see over here, the deactivate option is also there. You can deactivate also this one, and if you go to advanced, the split scope, obviously we don't need at this moment. Now see over here, IP address from 5 to 10. Okay, and this is the information about your DNS, and some advanced options are here that we are not going to configure at this moment. So this is so simple. So I believe the presentation that we had today, that was fruitful to you.